Lashana Tova again.
Shana Tova.
I told you I've already given you a couple of clues what I'm going to be speaking on. And you'll see as I get started. And Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau his brother in the land of Seir, the steppe of Edom. And he charged them, saying, Thus shall you say to my lord Esau, Thus says your servant Jacob, With Laban I have sojourned, and I tarried till now. And I have gotten oxen and donkeys and sheep and male and female slaves, and I sent ahead to tell my lord, to find favor in your eyes. And the messengers returned to Jacob, saying, We came to your brother, to Esau, and he is actually coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him. And Jacob was greatly afraid, and he was distressed. And he divided the people that were with him, and the sheep and the cattle and the camels, into 2 camps. And he thought, Should Esau come to the one camp and strike it, the remaining camp will escape. And he rose on that night and took his 2 wives and his 2 slave girls and his 11 boys, and he crossed over the ford of the Jabbok. And he took them and brought them across the stream, and he brought across all that he had. And Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the break of dawn. And he saw that he had not won out against him, and he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip socket was wrenched as he wrestled with him. And he said, Let me go, for dawn is breaking. And Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And he said to him, What is your name? And he said, Jacob. And he said, Not Jacob, henceforth shall your name be called, but Israel. For you have striven with God and men and won out. And Jacob asked and said, Tell your name, pray. And he said, Why should you ask my name? And there he blessed him. And Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, meaning, I have seen God face to face, and I came out alive. And the sun rose upon him as he passed Penuel, and he was limping on his hip, which is from Genesis 32, verses 3 to 8 and 22 to 31. The summer I turned 8, our parents built a new house where they still live. This was a modest home. If you are sufficiently recalled of such things, it was a Jim Walter home, so there were no frills. And the original floor plan didn't include a utility room. So once a week for the first few years, until my father had the back porch enclosed and laundry machines installed there, we had to go to take the dirty clothes to the laundrette at the end of our street, about a quarter of a mile away. It was just across the main street from the Quaker meeting in which I grew up, and there's still a coin-operated laundromat on the site. And Marcy is nodding because she knows exactly where it is. My parents worked opposite shifts, so our dad had to take the 3 of us kids with him when he did the laundry. I'm thinking it was on Thursday night. Anyway, being kids, we were always interested in the vending machines at the place. And they had both a snack machine and at least one drink machine. To tell you how long ago this was, the drinks were still in glass bottles. And yes, we called them drinks, not sodas or soda pop or colas or Cokes. That stuff invented and bottled down in Atlanta was Coca-Cola. So when my sister and I decided we were hungry enough for some good old-fashioned American junk food, like a Coca-Cola and a pack of peanuts, or some nabs, or a brownie and a brownie, what do you think we did? We did the obvious. we convinced our little brother that he wanted something too. And we sent him to ask Daddy, because Daddy would be more likely to say yes to the youngest one. Then we two older kids would get a snack and a drink as well. How hard was that to figure out? Now, we all know that parents shouldn't have favorites, and I'm not saying mine did or do for that matter. But interpersonal dynamics are what they are. And as a result, parents will often find it easier to relate to one or two of the children than to the others. In the book of Genesis, Isaac and Rebekah had favorites, which is always a bad idea. Isaac's favorite was Esau, the older twin, but Rebekah favored Jacob, the younger twin. This, of course, did nothing to promote good relations between the two brothers. Amy Jill Levine, who earned her doctorate at Duke and taught New Testament at Swarthmore, so she knows about us Quakers, and Vanderbilt before being appointed Distinguished Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies at the Hartford International University for Religion and Peace, writes in a somewhat different context that any Jew who heard a story beginning, there was this man who had two sons, the opening of the famous parable of the prodigal son, Luke 15:11-32, would immediately know that the brothers would not get along very well, and that the father would be generally ineffectual in bringing harmony to the household. The stories of Cain and Abel, Ishmael and Isaac, and Esau and Jacob, for example, do not set up an auspicious model for the prodigal and his dutiful older brother. You could easily add the stories of Joseph and his brothers, or the sons of King David. Absalom murders his half-brother Amnon. Adonijah and Solomon compete for the succession, and Solomon ends up executing Adonijah at the very first opportunity. But you get the point. Isaac and Rebekah were setting up their sons for a ferocious case of sibling rivalry. In my own case, my brother and I used to have our own trouble getting along. And the fact that we had to share a room while our sister had her own room didn't help matters. I'd be outside reading, minding my own business, and he'd come along and bug me until I'd swat at him, trying to get him to go away and just leave me alone. Then he'd go running to our grandma, telling her what I'd done, but not, of course, what he did before that, and I'd get in hot water with her. He used to do it so much that at least one of the neighbors noticed and mentioned it to my mother after Grandma died. Another time, he stabbed me in the forearm with a sharpened pencil. I have absolutely no memory of what we were arguing about. And on another occasion, I accidentally kicked him in the chest. I was aiming to kick him in the shin, but he ducked at the exact time I kicked. What are you going to do? I know that part of the friction was because there were no other kids in the neighborhood most of the time, and while I knew how to keep myself occupied, he always wanted a crowd around him. Then I went away to Guilford College, and the first weekend I came home, I was suddenly his long-lost best buddy. Go figure. Jacob and Esau had their own history of sibling rivalry. First off, they fought each other while still in the womb. Next, there was that lentil soup story, where Esau comes back hungry from a long but unsuccessful day of hunting and smells the lentil soup which Jacob is cooking out in the field over an open fire. The smell shoves everything else out of Esau's brain, to the point that he tells Jacob to slop me some of that red, because he can't even think of the word soup or stew. The story tells us that this was how Esau acquired the nickname Edom, red, but another story tells us that Esau was ruddy like a hairy mantle at birth, which earned him the nickname. Jacob, who would go on to prove himself a sharp dealer more than once, first made Esau sell him the birthright, the right to inherit the bulk of their father's property, and the position as the next head of the family, before Jacob would let him eat. To quote Joyce's childhood assessment of the situation when she first heard the story in Sunday school, Esau wasn't very smart, was he? No, Esau wasn't. As soon as he bargained away his birthright for the stew, quote, he ate and he drank and he got up and he went off. Then there was that time when Rebekah heard Isaac planning with Esau to give Esau his blessing, which would make sure that Esau inherited anyway. And she said to herself, oh, no, he won't. So Rebekah calls Jacob and tells him how to fool Isaac into thinking that he's blessing Esau when he's actually blessing Jacob. Rebekah's plan comes true. And when Esau finds out that it has, his first response is to throw a hissy fit and to beg Isaac to bless me also. Esau's second reaction, which Rebekah finds out about, is that he plans to wait for Isaac to die. He's an old man and blind after all. He can't live all that much longer. After which Esau will just kill Jacob and take everything back. In response, Rebekah talks Isaac into sending Jacob to her brother Laban in the old country, supposedly so that Jacob can find an acceptable wife, but really so that Esau won't murder Jacob. So Jacob goes to the old country, goes to work for Laban, ends up marrying both of Laban's daughters and starting his own family, and then starts building up his own wealth while he and Uncle Laban try to outmaneuver each other. Now it's 20 years later, and Jacob decides it's time to leave Laban, take his family, and go home. Up to this point in the narrative, Jacob, whose name is connected with a verbal root which can be translated as crookedness, has been confronting life very much on his own terms. Now, as he returns to his homeland, he has to confront some of the consequences derived from his former actions. He's having a dark night of the soul, if you will. And he isn't sure that he's going to make it through what's coming. So he does what he can to placate Esau, and then he wrestles all night with his mysterious visitor. In modern Judaism, in the 10 days between Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, which comes first, you are supposed to make amends. It's kind of like what Jesus says in the Gospels. If you are bringing your offering to the altar and you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift, go make things right, and then come back and make your offering. Well, so Jacob sends a present to placate Esau, and he hopes to make amends. Then he's confronted with somebody whom he sees first as a man, and that's all he's told. That's all he can tell. Well, who is that other figure? Contrary to some interpretations, this isn't a theophany, where God shows up and does the job personally. Why do I say that? In Genesis 32:27, the stranger apparently has to ask Jacob his name, and then he has to vanish before dawn. And neither of these sounds like God, especially bearing in mind that for much of what we Christians call the Old Testament, the appearance of an angel on the scene often signals a theophany. If you remember the story about Abraham bargaining to save as many people in Sodom and Gomorrah as he can, the angel who does all the talking is meant to be God. Nor does this mysterious figure seem to be an angel in the conventional sense for the same reasons. But Jacob is absolutely convinced that the man is connected with the presence of God somehow, and I do think that's correct. But I don't think it's much of a stretch to say that in modern terms, the mysterious visitor is also connected with Jacob confronting his own inner demons. In that case, Jacob is blessed because he does prevail against them, and he's given a new name. As in many branches of Christianity, a change of name signifies a change of life. That's why people in some churches receive new names at baptism, after all. It's also why new British monarchs and new popes choose the names by which they'll be known from that time forward. But look at the name Jacob receives, Israel. It can be translated into English as Prince of God. But the folk etymology in the story connects the name with the idea of striving with God and man and emerging victorious. What it probably meant originally was something like El, or God, rules. In other words, it was what is known as a theophoric name. The name tells you something about God, not about the person who bears the name. The most famous example of this in the Hebrew Bible is probably the name Emmanuel, God with us, which is completely reinterpreted by the Gospel of Matthew. The name also serves as a reminder to Jacob about who's really in charge. The new name is part blessing, part challenge, part goal, and part reminder to stay humble. Now compare Jacob's new name with his grandfather's name change. When Abram becomes Abraham, the process of transformation is more or less complete. The man is never referred to as Abram again. With Jacob, on the other hand, Israel never manages to displace Jacob entirely. And the two names become synonymous or parallel, especially in poetry. Jacob's new name gives him a goal to strive toward, and it also reminds him that God is ultimately in charge. But like most of us, Jacob has to live in the misty meantime, as my friend Bob Marshall used to say, forever making his way from the person he was to the person whom he has the potential to become. And that's another place where there are lessons for us, and why this story is appropriate for today, the end of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish celebration of the New Year. Some of you will have heard me tell how, when I was sitting in the meeting in Friargate in York years ago, it was opened to me that the Annunciation message to Mary, the Holy Ghost shall come upon thee, and the power of the highest shall overshadow thee. Therefore also that holy thing which shall be born of thee shall be called the Son of God, applies equally to us. And it can apply every day. Just as Jesus is both the Son of Mary and the Son of God and partakes of both natures, each time we go into the divine presence, we start out more like Mary and become closer to the nature of God if we walk according to the measure of light we are given. Like Jacob, we're on the journey between who we are now and who we have the potential to become. Amen.